Hi, this is Heidi Gaiman from ilovemyshepherd.com with another episode of Ministry Talks. Today we're going to talk about the church work marriage and specifically 6 dynamics of ministry in marriage. I have noticed that these particular dynamics, while alive and well in every marriage, so applicable and useful for everyone to hear about, tend to be amplified, at least in the church work marriage, and at least are worthy of talking about. Talking about in your marriage, around the table, talking about in our congregations, so we have a greater awareness and understanding about how the church work home and the ministry center, the church, the congregation, and all of that, how they interact in the systems that come into play, so we can better care for our church workers and better care for ourselves. So, there is this idea, and we even in undergraduate, we read a book called Life in the Fishbowl, and it was a good book, and there was a lot of awareness built for us around this idea that there is a publicness to church work life. Particularly, I sort of only know about clergy and ordained life for my own family, but working with all different church workers, I hear this from other families also. And I myself, being a worker in the church that isn't clergy, isn't ordained, I think it's just a reality of anyone being in kind of this public sphere, if you will. And this might even apply then to very active volunteers and stuff. However, I think some of the expectations and things can be exponential when it is your, not just your vocation, but it is your job, this church work life, this ministry life. So do we imagine some of the fishbowl? Do we imagine some of the expectations and pressures in church work life? I think there's a component of that. Like sometimes we subconsciously or consciously are all too aware of pressure, and then we make it bigger. We amplify it for ourselves. And then there is the very real interest in our lives, interest in, maybe how children are behaving in church work families at the church, interest in what that marriage looks like, interest in how we hold ourselves, various things. So we don't want to make too much of it, and we don't want to make too little of it, just like most things in life. And I think there is an earnest desire in the church worker, in the ministry person and their family to know Christ, to have him as a very real part of our lives, but to live in that sanctified process like the rest of Christians, to walk in that Christian walk and be a witness to people at, the very best we can be. We're aware we're sinners and we're saved by grace alone, but at the same time, we do want to be able to provide an exponential witness that creates growth for God's kingdom. And so some of that is pressure we put on ourselves. And again, some of that is pressure from this whole big ball of wax called ministry. I like to call the more realistic version of this, I guess, instead of a fishbowl, I like to call it a seeping in effect. And so that is this idea that we're such, like the congregation, particularly in parish ministry, the congregation is such a part of our lives that it seeps into our home. That's not always a terrible thing, right? Martin Luther in particular, the great reformer, called the family the little church. And so we all in our home should have some amount of church life seeping into our home. However, in ministry, again, this can be amplified where it's so much a part of our home that it seeps into all our conversations. It seeps into a lot of what we do. Not everybody has that. That might not be your reality. But it seeps into, in particular, our marriage because of the importance of church in our life, and the rightful importance of it. But we have to learn to develop some boundaries, some ways to deal with it, the way we can embrace it and let it in and have joy in it, but then also the times to say, okay, we have a marriage, we have a spiritual life outside of this congregation in our life, or even this institution, depending on your relationship with the ministry that you're involved with. All right, so 6 ministry dynamics. I don't have the right number of fingers. 6 marriage dynamic number 1. What's love and respect got to do with it? So love and respect is the way we refer sometimes to Ephesians 5. It's that love and respect chapter. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, submit to your husbands, and all of that gobbledygook that's really important and would take hours, days, and years to decompress with together. However, this respect factor is kind of one thing I want to focus on for the worker. If they are going into the field, if they're going into their church work vocation, and especially if it is a place of some disrespect to them, if it is a place where they receive a fair amount of criticism, which isn't true in all settings, but there is some of this in church work vocations. And like I said, you can see how this would be true in any vocation, that when we go into our professional settings, there is some criticism, and sometimes that's not delivered well. It's not constructive, especially then. So then it is hard. This is the important part about the marriage part. It is hard then to come home to any kind of criticism. And so we're sensitive about that in all homes. I wish, all of us were more sensitive about it. Maybe you're like way more better about that than I am. But I think this is a marriage struggle for everyone. Because it's wrapped up in like the church and spiritual things, I think the pressure and the heaviness of it is amplified. Like I said, I think there's a sense of heightened sensitivity to criticism in the church work marriage if the worker spouse that is in a church work vocation is hearing a lot of criticism. It weighs on them spiritually, and then when they come home, if there's some criticism, whether you intend disrespect or not, if it is perceived by them as disrespect, then there's a sensitivity to that. And so you might feel the impact of that on your marriage, and that's something just to bring up, to talk about, try to avoid. Worker, you can ask yourself, am I being more sensitive than usual? Is this outside of my normal personality? This sensitivity, when your spouse, maybe brings it up, before they bring it up. And then also at home, the spouse can ask themselves, like, is this my position to correct? Is this my place? For instance, like if your husband or a spouse is clergy, it can be really easy to be like, you've had better sermons. That was not my favorite. Like, you should have changed this, and this. It's so tempting. But like, you could see how maybe that would be a better place for someone else. But at the same time, there's times where it might be better. Like, your spouse might ask your input, and there might be a place or a way to say it that it can be heard. So just, asking the questions internally before we speak about things, asking ourselves if that's going to be useful, if it's going to be edifying for them, or is it good timing, things like that. It's also helpful to create a church to home transition, particularly when there's congregational work, but this is true in kind of institutional ministry or anything, to, have that 5 to 10 minute wind down time. I've heard from some people like commutes are really helpful for this, like listening to a podcast or just music, or silence in the car can be helpful. Or, when the kids were little, my husband would say, it's really helpful when, I just have like 5 to 10 minutes to go change my clothes and collect myself before, I'm like playing with Legos with the kids and things like that, or holding babies, things like that. And that might be true in any life stage. So however that works for you, but other ways to help a person wind down. The Gottman Institute calls it rituals of connection too, like whether we kiss our spouse when they come home, do we offer them something, if we're coming home at different times or after our spouse, or in 2 different worker situations where we're like ships passing in the night, like how do we connect again and come back together so it's not like we're connecting and suddenly it's about church, some maybe in between with that. It's been helpful for some workers I've talked to journal stuff about church, even to say, like, you know what, I need to journal this instead of talk about it, to kind of know that need. Knowing when to, it's just like arguments. This is not a good time and space to talk about this, where's an appropriate place to talk about things you might, it's not uncommon for workers and their spouses to disagree about certain things about church, because we're not identical people in marriages, and that's okay. I think we want to be on the same spiritual plane, and sometimes we understand that to be agreeing on styles of worship, or what different small groups should look like, or what Sunday school should look like, whatever, when really that's not what it's about. Like, those different kind of adiaphora things we will maybe not see eye to eye on. And is that okay? Is that the culture in our marriage that's okay? Instead, when it, being on the same, spiritual growth field is reading the word together, praying together, both individually being disciples and growing in our faith walk. So those are important things. And find your own language of love and respect. Ask your spouse. I definitely recommend the book. Just look at how they receive respect, how you receive love, and vice versa. Like, how do we communicate, and whether it's helpful or not is something good to analyze. It's important to accept influence from one another. So if your spouse, dearest worker, if your spouse gives suggestions, maybe being open to hearing them sometimes in a place of love, like that is not always their criticism. Unlike maybe some people that you interact with in your profession, giving the best perspective to our spouse in whatever they say and do is as important as, identifying what language is really helpful and everything. Let's look at marriage dynamic number 2. Marriage dynamic number 2. This dynamic is called "They Appreciate Me." And so this dynamic plays into the fact that in ministry life, sometimes people think you're really cool. Like, it's not always, hard criticism and difficult church life. Sometimes your professional life, that ministry life, is the realm where things are going really well. And so I hear this especially from worker families that have very young children, particularly like a stay-at-home spouse, or workers who are maybe early, like new retirement, things like that. This is a struggle sometimes when at church, everybody thinks I'm really cool, and they, might give compliments about the way I do my work. I just, you can see again how this happens in any profession where someone's like doing really great professionally, and then their home life is like, it's just hard. Like, kids need to be cared for, and marriage takes a lot of work, and it goes through seasons of wonderfulness and seasons of kind of desertiness and all of that stuff. And so we feel the weight of that. So sometimes our home life will be the place going well, and church will not be going great, and then vice versa. And so there's a few things here that are important to consider. Number one, especially what, again, Gottman Institute, like #1 marriage researchers in the nation, call harsh startup. So again, with the transitions of work to home, home to work, especially in congregational ministry, being able to have that connection instead of, here, take the baby, or why weren't you home 5 minutes ago? But instead having like that first thing, and those first like 5 minutes of interaction, even 30 seconds is what the research shows us, 30 seconds of interaction being positive before maybe there's some like irritation shared or some frustration and things like that. We want to make sure we're working on that. One of the things Gottman say is that from their research, they can tell that the very beginning, that startup of conversation, the startup of life together there, really reflects what the rest of it's going to look like. So, it's harder to regroup than to start well. So something to think about, just protecting those first 5 to 15 minutes when you come together again after, doing ministry, doing work, doing all those things. Another thing to think about in this whole "they appreciate me" dynamic is whose opinion do I value most? I think sometimes we can start to feel like in ministry marriages that we are secondary to ministry. And that starts to feel I am not gonna sugarcoat it. It starts to feel a little bit like the same feelings that people reflect with adultery. Like, I'm not as desirable as much as ministry is to you. I'm not worthy of the time that ministry is to you. And so there's a really difficult dynamic with this because we're working for God. I mean, of course, God is first, right? But we need to remember the distinction between what Gene Veith and Mary Murby in Family Vocation call like that kind of first tablet and second tablet commands. So is this serving God or serving my neighbor? A ministry is serving your neighbor, actually. Our relationship with God is in devotion to Him and in our personal walk with Him. And so, yes, of course, we're serving God's kingdom in ministry, but we're doing it through providing the service for our neighbor, providing the gospel for our neighbor, and all of that stuff. And so I think that helps us to understand that, like, in putting ministry before our family, and there'll be times like we need to put more time into ministry than our family, and other times we're going to need to put more time into our family than ministry. I heard one professor say, it's not a balance. We're not trying to balance things. We're trying to do both. Like, we're trying to care and share in both. And it's going to be different at different times. However, there's a difference between that and this dynamic that I'm talking about where we're seeking after ministry and giving them the kind of quality, the kind of attention, the kind of care, and then really proactively often putting them above our family. Our family needs ministry too. Our spouse needs ministry too. And that is a huge outcry of, God's work in our life, what He's called us to. We can never put one vocation above another. God will always be first, but that's about our walk with Him, not our work for Him. Okay, so some things within this dynamic: making home a safe place, just, bringing lots of grace to the table, having grace for the person in ministry as well as person in ministry. Give some grace to the family for what they need, and we all need at different times. Be vocal about what you need. Value the dinner table. I'm continuously amazed at how many families on the earth, in our culture, especially in America here, that we don't eat dinner together. This is a really powerful thing, the family dinner table. And if that's the only time you get to spend together a few times a week, just do it. You can see a big difference, and maybe even especially when you don't have children, or you don't have children with you. And even for our single workers, having people to gather with around the table is a really big piece of our relational health. So just do it. Go on date night, the same thing that you do to avoid adultery, like I said. And I know it might be very uncomfortable, kind of this comparison, but you want to care for your marriage in a way that doesn't let the foxes in, is what the Song of Songs says. The foxes that spoil the vineyard, we don't want to let those in. We're going to do the same thing to protect it from ministry, essentially, that we are from any other kind of attention that we might give, too much attention to a person or a place or whatever. So value the bedroom. Do not neglect the gifts of God that He has given married spouses to share together. That's really important. And sometimes you might need to put that higher on your list of priorities than they have been for a season, because we have a lot of excuses why we avoid sex in marriage. And I think that there's a lot of power in that physical joining. There's a lot of power in that spiritual, mental, the whole mystery of the one flesh. So let it happen. Make time for it, and ask questions of one another. What do you need? Marriage ministry dynamic number 3. They need me. They need me. So this is this dynamic where, again, we said, we think by putting ministry before our family, we are putting God before our family. And I think we get that really confused. And churches are needy. There's a lot of people and a lot of care that needs to happen, and that's important. I don't want to like make that little. Even in like teaching profession, if you are a school teacher within the church, like that seems so important. There's like children, and you could always just be feeding them and tending to them and showing up for everything. It's a very real need and a very real burden. And then there's this really ultimate thing that's people are dying every day and they don't know Jesus. Like, this is important. We want to see people come to know the Lord. So sometimes it can take, just a real forefront. But remember, our families need Jesus too. And we can't control whether our children leave the church. Honestly, we can't control whether our spouse stays in the church or stays connected to Jesus. But our relationships do have influence over one another, and we want to tend to that. We want to tend to those family vocations. It is not less ministry when you're at home. That's actually an important component of your ministry. A little bit different than your profession, your job, and all those things. But I really believe that ministry is this broader category, and it's important to tend to our home and family. And the Bible says that we need to take care of our families when we're in leadership in the church. So communicate early and often. State what you need. It's so easy to like be irritated and frustrated and hold it all right here. Sometimes I just need to state like, I need maybe you to do this on Thursday because I need to go do this and this, this, and this. Just state what you need. I don't think this is going really well. How can we communicate better on this issue? Things like that. Again, assume the best. I could say it over and over and over again. It's really easy to be like, I don't feel loved when you do this. And I say that, and I've said that many times. And I appreciate that my husband's like, do you honestly believe I don't love you? So, just putting the best perspective on things while being realistic is a good thing. And get creative. Be really creative about how you spend time together, how you make time for family, how you make time for ministry. Those kind of things. Be creative. All right, keep moving along. Marriage dynamic number 4. I don't want to burden him or her. So this happens on the spouse's end, where ministry is really important. And you're like, look at all they're doing, and it's so important. And like, right now at our congregation, we have some vacancies. And so my husband's doing just a lot. And it's like, well, that needs to be done. And that's really important too. And I don't want to add anything. So it is good to be aware of when is just, not a good time to address this certain need I have or whatever of mine. However, it can, instead of actually, remove burden from our spouse, we can actually instead like be storing it up more often if we don't share. And so I think that happens more often than we like to think. It seems like saving souls is more important than taking the garbage out. So for the first 3 days, the garbage really needs to go out. I am not going to say anything because I know he's busy and blah, blah, blah. And then, holy shnikes, am I angry on day 4. And I'm like, you take the garbage out. And right. This sounds like just our dynamic, Dave and Heidi. But the reality is I see this in marriages a lot. And I don't think it's a male-female specific thing either. I think it's pretty common that this happens in spouses that aren't in ministry too. But I especially see it amplified in ministry families where we don't want to burden the really important work of ministry. So we kind of keep things to ourselves. We try to manage. We try to be the person doing a bunch of stuff. And then at some point, we're just kind of hacked. If you don't say your burden out loud, they're going to feel it anyway. It's still in the room. And maybe they're kind of oblivious to that at times, but it will show up at some point, I guess is what I'm saying. And a lot of times it shows up brighter and bolder and not as nice. So instead, again, saying what we need. I call this the crazy caregiver cycle. So if your spouse is a caregiver of any kind, I'm sure this probably happens with, spouses who do like healthcare professions or social work things and different things like that they're doing all this really important work that you don't want to burden them. So you create instead this crazy thing where you're like, I'm fine. I'm not fine. that kind of thing. So love is spelled Time. Love is spelled Time. Like, we need time together. And I get that everybody has their love languages and all that stuff. But making time for the family, making time as a couple, making time for the house. I mean, especially if you own a house, it takes time and energy. And if you don't, you still have to like clean and stuff. And that's part of married life. That's part of life together. And then maybe creating a block day. Maybe you take a day off every week. How do you tend to one another's, like just having good times together and creating, fun and meaning, but then also how do you take care of those burdens, the stuff that needs to get done and everything. Making a list, what all needs to be done in a given week. How do we organize ourselves? Start there. And remembering that God fills in where we can't. He is the overflowing cup, and he will help us in these things, and sometimes they seem really big, and other times we can recognize the smallness of some of it, but he really will help us fill in and manage, all the time. Marriage dynamic number 5, we have no money. We have no money, and the struggle is real. Again, you can see how this would be true in many marriages, but in ministry, it seems to be amplified because there's this little bit of belief, I would say, that, there is a sacrifice to ministry, which is, I think, 75% true, that we are, sacrificing maybe more money that would be had in a secular field. I don't know that that's always true in our culture anymore, but at the same time, there's plenty of it that's true. That there is sacrifice that families are making to be in ministry. And, it's really easy to just always want a little bit more. So kind of guarding your heart against that, like flat out coveting, like, oh, I wish we had that. I wish our life looked a little bit more like that. There's a belief that it's hard to budget because the paycheck is either nil or lower. But I think there is power in budgeting, especially when funds are really limited. And let's be honest, for most of us, funds are limited. That's the way it is. And remembering the miracle that is a paycheck, and I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer here because I know the struggle is real with money. But Paul was a tent maker. And he encouraged the church to give, and he cheered them on when they gave in their stewardship. But it is quite a miracle, I feel like, that people gather together and hire someone to preach the Word of God, to teach the Word of God, to go do the service of God, and they actually issue a paycheck for it, especially in our culture. And as we move forward, I feel like we just, honoring that miracle can be really helpful, even when you're frustrated with the budget and with, the amount of maybe raises that aren't happening, and maybe misunderstandings in congregational life of our incomes also. So no matter what the church does, also honor what the worker is bringing home, because they have very little control over it, if any. Just honoring the provision there for that worker is really important, even when we're frustrated about it, because we don't want to tie their worth, their respect to, and their love, to the provision that's coming home. Debt is a huge problem in church work land, a huge problem. And so that you can look at our finances and budgeting ministry talks about that. And I really encourage you to look into some ideas. I know I work within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and we have like a worker wellness page. And if you're in a different denomination, see what wellness things are available for financial wellness in your denomination or across denominations, or books at the library or whatever. It is a real problem, and we want to be good stewards. So, just keep being encouraged in that, and know that you're not alone. Marriage dynamic number 6, the final dynamic, the spiritual mountaintop and then the spiritual desert. So especially in ministry, in all parts of the Christian walk, we will find those mountaintop moments where we feel so spiritually filled and so close to God, and times when we feel like we're walking alone. And we know it's not about what we feel. We know that Christ is always with us, that Jesus is caring for us, that the Spirit is in us, and our faith is assured, and we keep walking forward. However, there is the burden of the times we struggle with our faith, those deserts, those valleys even. And so ministry in particular, because there's so many disappointments alongside of the awesome joys. There's so many mountaintops in ministries and deserts in ministries that they seep in. Remember, back to the seeping in effect into our marriages and families. So when it's good, when ministry is good, it's so good. It is, I mean, I wouldn't give it up for the world, the fact that, wow, we like work for God. That's so amazing. And I mean, to be able to meet with someone and to care for their spiritual needs and to share the love of Jesus together. And wow, there's nothing like it. However, when it's bad, it's really bad. And I think because spiritual things are important, spiritual things, like that's what God wants us to focus on. They're more important to him than anything else. So when it's bad, it feels very personal, I guess. It overlaps and it seeps into our personal spiritual growth, our spiritual life, or the spiritual life of our marriage and families. And so that can be really hard. I don't think we can change it. I think we just need to be aware of it and stay the course, walk with God, ask him for help. There's no shame in seasons where, I know people who have left the ministry. No shame. No shame. Your spiritual life, your spiritual walk is more important, and your family is more important than ministry. God will call you back if that's what he deigns, and there's plenty of ministry to be done when it's not full-time, when it's not, you're not on somebody's payroll. However, even to walk through that desert, to stay the course, to stay strong, to be in that ministry, to do those things, also good. And we're not judging either. We're asking God, what he's doing in this season, what he's doing, and where he would be leading us. So be careful of academic Christianity, both in your personal walk, but also in families. I think sometimes we get so connected to the way the word should be teached. That's not a word. The word should be taught, that we forget to just let our kids ask questions, our spouse ask questions, to ask questions ourselves, and just have that freedom in spirituality instead of having the right answers and being able to provide them. So the need for mentors, we all need mentors and friends. Sometimes I like to call them co-conspirators, especially friends in ministries. Do you have a mentor? Does your spouse have a mentor? Do you have a marriage mentor? And there's another episode about that. We all need marriage mentors in our life who show us how to do marriage well. And it's such a blessing, and it's hard to find, but if you can find another couple in ministry that's doing it really well together, those are good people to go to ask questions. Yours isn't going to look the same. Your marriage isn't going to look the same. But, find that couple, find those marriage mentors. Just tending to the marriage, do date night, feed the marriage just like you feed the flock, give it the word, give it prayer, give it time together. And let your marriage be a mission field in itself. Let your marriage speak God's love into other people's lives, but most certainly speak God's love into one another's life. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them up in the comments. You can check out the show notes. You can email me at ilovemyshepherd.com@gmail.com. We have an entire marriage and family page on I Love My Shepherd, and you can look up different articles about some of the stuff we talked about on there. And we always come out with new resources too. In my book, Altogether Beautiful, we also study through the Song of Songs and address many, many marriage things and the shape of marriage in there. And so there's insight to be had there too. If I can help anyway, let me know, and I'll see you next time.